A cold wind swept through the quiet streets as a tired Navy veteran stepped off the bus with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a loyal German shepherd walking beside him. After 20 years at sea, Jack thought coming home would finally bring peace. But when he opened the door, the house was empty, and the life he once knew was already gone. With nowhere left to go, he and his dog drove back to the small town where he grew up, just to see his childhood home one last time. But what he discovered inside that old house would change everything he believed about family, loss, and the past. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I always love seeing our community from all over the world. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about loyalty, resilience, and second chances, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Early winter had already settled over Norfolk, Virginia, a coastal city known for its massive naval base and long gray skies in the colder months. A sharp Atlantic wind swept through the streets that morning, carrying the smell of salt and cold metal from the harbor. Low clouds hung heavy above the rows of brick houses and aging apartment blocks near the base, turning the afternoon light into a dull, pale glow. The cold in Norfolk was never dramatic like a northern blizzard. Instead, it crept quietly into bones and joints, lingering in the air like an old memory that refused to fade. On the far side of the naval installation, a tall man walked slowly along the sidewalk with a large dog at his side. Jack Miller looked like a man carved from years of hard discipline. At 45, he still carried the broad shoulders and straight posture of someone who had spent most of his adult life in uniform. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, with a powerful frame that had once been stronger, though time and injuries had begun to show their cost. His dark brown hair was cut short in a simple military style, now touched with faint strands of gray near the temples. A short, neatly trimmed beard framed his square jaw, and a thin scar ran across his right eyebrow, one of the many quiet souvenirs from years of deployments overseas. His eyes were a deep, steady blue. The kind of eyes that had seen too many long nights at sea, too many missions that never made the news, and too many moments where silence meant survival. Jack had spent more than 20 years in the U.S. Navy, much of it attached to special operations units that worked in places most civilians never heard about. Long deployments, dangerous missions, and the constant pressure of responsibility had shaped him into someone calm, disciplined, and quiet around strangers. But recently, his body had begun to protest. Old injuries in his back and shoulder had worsened. A persistent tremor sometimes ran through his left hand after long periods of strain. Navy doctors had examined him carefully over several months before delivering the verdict he never expected to hear. It was time for him to step down. Not because he wanted to, because his body no longer allowed him to continue the way he once had. For Jack, leaving the Navy felt less like retirement and more like being quietly removed from the only life he truly understood. Walking beside him was Rex, a large German shepherd whose thick coat of sable and black fur rippled slightly in the wind. Rex was nearly 6 years old, already mature, but still powerful and alert. His ears stood upright like twin antennas, constantly turning toward distant sounds most people never noticed. The dog moved with the controlled confidence of a trained working animal. His amber-brown eyes remained watchful, scanning every corner of the street as if still on duty. Rex had served alongside Jack for several years during specialized operations overseas. Though many military working dogs were assigned to handlers temporarily, Rex and Jack had formed an unusually strong bond. The dog had learned to recognize Jack's voice, his breathing patterns, even the subtle tension in his body before a dangerous moment. More than once, Rex had saved lives. once by detecting explosives hidden beneath a roadside bridge, another time by pulling Jack to the ground seconds before gunfire erupted from a rooftop window. The Navy officially listed Rex as a military working dog, but to Jack he was something far simpler. Family. Now the two of them walked away from the base gates together, neither of them wearing a uniform anymore. A black pickup truck waited nearby in the parking lot. Jack placed a worn duffel bag into the truck bed and rested his hand briefly on Rex's head. "All right, partner," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but the words carried a weight neither of them fully understood yet. "Let's go home." The drive across Norfolk took less than 30 minutes. Rows of modest houses passed outside the window, many built decades earlier for military families rotating in and out of the base. The neighborhoods were quiet that afternoon, most residents still at work while the cold wind rattled bare tree branches along the streets. Jack's house stood near the end of a narrow road lined with small maple trees. It was a modest two-story place with pale blue siding and a wooden porch that faced the street. The house wasn't large, but it had once been warm and lively. Jack had bought it nearly 10 years earlier, not long after marrying his wife. When he pulled the truck into the driveway, something felt wrong immediately. The porch light was off, the curtains were open, and the front yard looked strangely empty. Jack stepped out of the truck slowly. Rex jumped down beside him, sniffing the cold air as his ears tilted forward. The front door was locked. Jack pulled out his key and opened it. The moment he stepped inside, the silence hit him like a sudden drop in temperature. The living room was empty. The couch was gone. The bookshelf he and his wife had assembled together years ago had disappeared. Even the framed photos that once covered the walls were missing. Only faint rectangular patches on the paint remained where the frames had hung. Jack walked further into the house, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. The kitchen cabinets were half empty. The bedroom closet stood open. Most of the clothes were gone. Rex padded quietly behind him, his nails clicking lightly against the floorboards. The dog sniffed around the rooms, as if trying to understand where everyone had gone. Jack stood in the middle of the living room for a long moment, staring at the empty space. Then he slowly pulled out his phone. He scrolled to a familiar contact name, Olivia Miller, his wife. The call rang several times before someone answered. "Jack?" Her voice sounded tired. Olivia Miller was 38 years old, a few years younger than Jack. She had always been known among friends for her calm kindness and quiet patience. Olivia stood about 5'6", with a slender build and soft features that gave her an almost gentle appearance. Her hair was a warm chestnut brown that usually fell to her shoulders in loose waves, and her pale skin carried faint freckles across the bridge of her nose. But what most people noticed first about Olivia were her eyes. They were a deep hazel color that often reflected emotion easily, especially worry. During the early years of their marriage, Olivia had been cheerful and optimistic, always believing that Jack's dangerous job would somehow work out. She had worked as a pediatric nurse at a nearby hospital, spending her days caring for children and her nights waiting for messages from wherever Jack had been deployed. But over time, the long silences between missions had changed her. Every news report about overseas conflicts made her heart race. Every unknown phone number filled her with dread. Every night without a message forced her to imagine the worst. Years of that fear had slowly worn her down. "Where are you?" Jack asked quietly. There was a long pause on the line. Then Olivia spoke again, her voice trembling. "I didn't know when you'd be back." Jack glanced around the empty living room. "I'm back now." Another silence followed. When Olivia finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one hurt to say. "I'm sorry, Jack." Her voice broke slightly. "I waited as long as I could. I really did." Jack leaned one hand against the wall beside him. "I know," he said softly. "You were always gone," Olivia continued. "Weeks, months sometimes. And when you were gone, I never knew if you were safe. I never knew if the next phone call would be someone telling me you weren't coming home." Her breathing grew uneven. "I couldn't live like that anymore." Jack closed his eyes for a moment. "Are you safe?" he asked. "Yes." A pause. "I met someone," Olivia admitted quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the branches of the trees along the street. Jack opened his eyes again and looked around the empty house. "I understand," he said. And he meant it. Because deep down, he knew the truth. While he had been protecting his country, Olivia had been fighting a different kind of battle alone. One that had slowly exhausted her. "You deserve a life without that fear," Jack added calmly. Olivia began to cry softly on the other end of the line. "I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't." Jack took a slow breath. "The house is still in your name, too," he said. "Keep it." Olivia didn't respond for several seconds. Then she whispered, "Jack." But he had already made his decision. After the call ended, Jack stood quietly in the empty living room. Rex walked over and sat beside him, pressing his shoulder gently against Jack's leg. Jack reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Well, partner," he murmured, "looks like it's just us now." The house felt colder than before. Jack walked upstairs one last time. He opened a small wooden box that had remained untouched in the closet. Inside were only a few things he cared about. An old photograph of his parents. A worn pocket knife his father had given him when he was a teenager. And a folded map of a small town in Wyoming. The town where he had grown up. Jack placed the items into his duffel bag. Then he walked out of the house without looking back. Rex followed him down the porch steps as the cold Norfolk wind swept across the empty street. Neither of them knew it yet. But the road they were about to take would lead them back to a place that had been waiting for them for decades. The road west stretched endlessly beneath a pale winter sky. For 3 days, Jack Miller drove across the United States with little more than a duffel bag in the passenger seat and Rex resting behind him in the back of the truck. The journey carried them through long highways, frozen plains, and quiet towns where gas stations glowed like small islands of light in the cold darkness. By the time they reached Wyoming, the landscape had changed completely. Wide valleys rolled beneath distant mountain ranges, their peaks dusted with fresh snow. Pine forests covered the hillsides like dark green blankets, and the wind carried a dry, biting chill that made the air feel sharper than the humid cold back in Virginia. Jack rolled down the truck window slightly. The cold air rushed in, filling the cab with the scent of pine and snow. For the first time in weeks, he breathed deeply. Rex lifted his head from the seat behind him, ears pricking forward. The German shepherd sniffed the air carefully, as if recognizing something familiar buried in the scent of the mountains. They were getting close. The small town of Red Creek, Wyoming, appeared gradually along the highway. A quiet settlement tucked between low hills and dense forests. A faded wooden sign stood at the town entrance, its paint chipped by years of harsh winters. Population, 1,842. Jack hadn't seen the town in more than 20 years. Back then, Red Creek had been the entire world to a restless teenage boy who dreamed of leaving for something bigger. Now, It looked almost exactly the same. A single main street ran through the center of town. Old brick buildings lined the road, some still thriving, others shuttered and quiet. Snow rested along the sidewalks in uneven piles where the wind had pushed it during the previous night's storm. Jack drove slowly past the familiar streets. The old diner was still there. So was the small grocery store that had once hired him for summer work when he was 16. Time seemed to move differently in places like this. Rex stood up in the back seat suddenly, placing his front paws against the truck window. His ears tilted forward sharply as they passed a narrow road leading uphill. Jack noticed immediately. "Easy, boy," he said. But Rex gave a short, low bark. The dog's tail began wagging slowly, something he rarely did unless he recognized a place or person. Jack followed the road with his eyes. It led toward a quiet neighborhood near the edge of town, toward the place where he had grown up. He hesitated for a moment. Then he turned the wheel. The truck climbed the gentle slope until the houses became more spaced apart, each sitting on wide patches of land, surrounded by old wooden fences and tall pine trees. Jack slowed the truck as they reached the end of the road. And there it was, his childhood home. The house stood alone on a small hill overlooking a frozen field. Time had not been kind to it. The once white paint had faded to a dull gray, and several boards along the porch railing were cracked or missing. Tall weeds pushed through patches of snow around the yard. The place looked tired. Jack parked the truck along the gravel shoulder. For a long moment, he simply sat there. Memories began surfacing quietly in his mind. Running across that field with his father during summer evenings, helping his mother plant flowers along the porch. The smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen every morning before school. Rex suddenly jumped out of the truck the moment Jack opened the door. The German Shepherd landed on the snowy ground and immediately began trotting toward the house. "Rex!" Jack called. But the dog had already reached the yard. Rex sniffed the air intensely, then moved toward the front porch with increasing excitement. His tail wagged faster as he circled the steps. Then he stopped and barked. Once. Then again. Jack walked toward the house slowly. Rex stood at the base of the porch steps, staring at the door as if waiting for someone to answer. "Easy," Jack murmured, placing a hand on the dog's neck. That was when he noticed the wooden sign attached to the fence post near the driveway. White letters on a red background. "For sale." Jack frowned slightly. He hadn't expected that. The house had been sold years earlier after his parents lost it to the bank. He assumed another family had been living there ever since. But now the property looked abandoned. A small plastic box hung beneath the sign containing a flyer with contact information. Jack pulled it out. The listing agent's name was printed at the top. Daniel Harper, Red Creek Realty. Jack studied the number for a long moment. Buying this place again would be reckless. His savings from the Navy were not endless. The money had been meant to support him while he figured out the next stage of his life. Spending most of it on an old house in a town he hadn't lived in for 2 decades made no practical sense. But Rex was still sitting on the porch steps, watching the door, waiting. Jack exhaled slowly. "Guess we're doing this," he muttered. He pulled out his phone. The call connected after 2 rings. A man answered with a steady, professional voice. "Red Creek Realty, this is Daniel Harper." Daniel Harper sounded like a man in his early 50s, and when Jack met him an hour later, that impression proved accurate. Daniel was tall, about 6'2", with a lean frame and weathered features shaped by years of outdoor life in Wyoming. His hair had once been dark, but was now streaked heavily with gray, and a short, salt-and-pepper beard covered his jawline. Despite the rugged appearance, his eyes carried a calm friendliness that suggested he was well known in the town. He drove an old green pickup truck that looked nearly as old as the house they stood in front of. "You serious about buying this place?" Daniel asked after stepping out of the truck. Jack nodded. "I grew up here." Daniel looked at the house again. "Then you probably know it needs a lot of work." "I do." Daniel studied him for a moment. Then his expression softened. "Well," he said, pulling a folder from his truck, "sometimes the right people find their way back to the right places." The paperwork took less than 2 hours. Jack signed the final documents sitting on the hood of Daniel's truck while the cold wind swept across the open field. When it was done, Daniel handed him a small metal key. "Welcome home," he said. The word lingered in the air long after Daniel drove away. Jack walked slowly toward the porch. Rex followed close beside him. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Dust floated through thin beams of winter sunlight streaming through the windows. The house smelled of old wood and thyme. Jack stepped inside. The floorboards groaned softly beneath his boots. Most of the furniture was gone, but the structure remained exactly as he remembered. The living room walls still carried faint pencil marks where his parents had once measured his height every year. Jack ran his hand gently across the wall. He found one line labeled, "Jack, age 12." Another labeled, "Jack, age 15." His throat tightened slightly. Rex wandered through the room, sniffing every corner as if exploring a forgotten territory. Then the dog returned and sat beside Jack quietly. Outside, the Wyoming wind rattled the loose boards of the old porch. Jack looked around the silent house. For the first time in months, the emptiness around him didn't feel like loss. It felt like possibility. Night came quickly in the Wyoming mountains. By early evening, the temperature in Red Creek had already dropped below freezing. A steady wind drifted across the hills, pushing thin clouds across the moon and making the tall pine trees creak softly in the darkness. Inside the old house, the air was even colder. Jack Miller knelt beside the large stone fireplace in the living room, examining the rusted metal grate with a small flashlight. The house had clearly been empty for a long time. Dust coated the wooden floor, and the faint smell of old timber filled the rooms. The fireplace had once been the heart of the house. Jack remembered winter nights when his parents sat nearby, drinking coffee while snow piled against the windows outside. Back then, the fire burned bright enough to warm the entire living room. Now the fireplace looked worn and neglected. Jack removed a few loose stones from the edge and brushed away a layer of soot that had hardened over the years. "We'll get you working again," he muttered quietly. Behind him, Rex lay stretched across the wooden floor. The German shepherd had spent most of the day exploring every inch of the house. Now the 6-year-old dog rested calmly, though his ears still twitched at the faintest sound. Rex was built like many working-line shepherds, tall, muscular, with powerful shoulders and a thick coat of sable and black fur. A thin, pale scar ran along the side of his muzzle, a reminder of one of the dangerous missions he and Jack had survived overseas. Despite his intimidating appearance, Rex had an unusually calm temperament when he wasn't on duty. Years of military training had taught him discipline and patience. But something suddenly caught his attention. Rex lifted his head. His ears turned toward the wall behind the fireplace. Then he stood up. Jack heard the movement and glanced over his shoulder. "What is it?" Rex walked slowly toward the far side of the fireplace wall. His nose lowered close to the wooden boards as he sniffed carefully. Then he began scratching. At first it was gentle, but within seconds the scratching became more urgent. The dog let out a short bark. Jack frowned. "Hey!" he said, standing up. "What did you find?" Rex continued pawing at one specific plank in the wall. His claws scraped the wood repeatedly while he sniffed along the edges. The behavior wasn't random. Jack had seen Rex act like this before, usually when the dog sensed something hidden. Jack grabbed the flashlight and stepped closer. The wooden plank Rex had chosen looked slightly different from the others. The grain ran at a slightly different angle, and a thin line of dust had settled along the edges. Jack pressed his hand against the board. It moved slightly. "That's odd." He walked to his duffel bag and pulled out a small multi-tool knife. Within a minute, he had carefully pried the plank loose. The board came free with a dull creak. Behind it was a small, hollow space inside the wall. Jack shined the flashlight inside. Something lay hidden there. 2 small envelopes. They were old. Very old. The paper had turned yellow with age, and the corners had curled slightly from years of dryness. Jack reached inside slowly and pulled them out. Each envelope had a name written on the front. The handwriting was instantly familiar. The first one read, "For Jack, from Dad." The second read, "For Jack, from Mom." Jack's chest tightened. He sat down slowly on the floor beside the fireplace. For a moment, he simply stared at the envelopes. Rex came over and sat quietly beside him, watching. Jack opened the first letter carefully. The paper inside was fragile, but the words were still readable. His father's handwriting was strong and slightly uneven, the same way Jack remembered from childhood notes and birthday cards. Jack began reading. "Jack, if you are reading this, something incredible must have happened. Your mother and I hid these letters here before we left this house. At the time, the bank had already taken everything. We had no choice but to sell the place to pay our debts. We knew we would probably never see this house again. But before we left, we had a strange thought. What if, someday, our son came back? What if, many years from now, you became the kind of man who might return to this town and buy this house again? We know the chances are almost impossible. But hope is a strange thing. It makes people believe in miracles. So we hid these letters where only someone who truly belonged to this house might eventually find them. If you are reading this now, then that small hope came true. And that means something in your life led you back home. No matter how hard life has been, remember something important. You always belong somewhere. And for you, that place started here. Dad." Jack lowered the letter slowly. The living room felt silent except for the soft whistle of wind outside. He swallowed once before reaching for the second envelope. This one carried his mother's soft, rounded handwriting. He opened it carefully. "My dear Jack, if you found this letter, then the miracle your father dreamed about has happened. That means you came home. When we left this house, my heart broke. Not because we lost the building, but because I was afraid we might lose the memories inside it. Your father and I raised you here. Every corner of this house holds laughter, arguments, birthdays, and quiet mornings. We didn't want those memories to disappear forever. So we left these letters with one tiny hope. Maybe one day, our son would grow into the kind of man strong enough to find his way back. If that day ever came, we wanted you to know something. You were always our greatest joy, no matter where life took you. We were always proud of you. And if you're reading this now, it means you've already done something remarkable. You came home. Love always, Mom." Jack sat completely still after finishing the letter. The room felt warmer somehow, though the fireplace still held no fire. He looked around the old living room again. The walls, the worn wooden floor, the marks on the wall where his height had been measured year after year. His parents had hidden those letters decades ago, believing there was almost no chance he would ever find them. And yet somehow, he had. Jack leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time since leaving the Navy, for the first time since Olivia had walked away, the emptiness inside him felt different. Not gone, but quieter. Rex lay down beside him and rested his head against Jack's knee. Jack reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Well," he whispered softly, "I guess we really did come home." The snowstorm arrived faster than anyone in town expected. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of dull steel, and the wind howled through the pine forest like a living thing. Thick snow began to fall in heavy waves, swallowing roads, fences, and rooftops within hours. Jack stood on the small wooden porch of the old house, watching the storm roll in across the valley. He pulled the collar of his heavy jacket higher around his neck. Years in the Marines had taught him how quickly weather could turn dangerous. Beside him, Rex sat silently. The German Shepherd was about 5 years old, large and powerful, with thick black and tan fur now dusted with snowflakes. His amber eyes were alert, always scanning the distance. A faded bandage still wrapped around his shoulder from the injury he had suffered weeks earlier. But he moved with the steady confidence of a trained working dog. Rex lifted his nose into the wind. Then he gave a low, uneasy growl. Jack understood the signal instantly. "Yeah," he murmured quietly. "It's going to be a bad one." Within an hour, the power across town failed. The lights inside Jack's house flickered once, twice, then disappeared into darkness. Only the faint glow of a lantern lit the small living room. Jack sighed, setting the lantern on the table. He could have stayed home and waited out the storm. Most people probably would. But as the wind rattled the windows, a memory crept into his mind. His father, standing outside during a storm, helping a neighbor fix a fallen fence. His mother cooking hot soup for families whose power had gone out. Growing up, Jack had seen them do it again and again. Help first, ask questions later. For a long time, Jack believed he had nothing in common with them. Now he wasn't so sure. He grabbed his heavy coat. "Come on, Rex," he said. The dog was already at the door. The town looked almost unrecognizable beneath the storm. Snow piled against abandoned cars. Streetlights stood dark and silent. Jack drove slowly through the streets in his old pickup truck, the engine rumbling steadily through the storm. The first place he stopped was the small white church near the center of town. A handful of people stood outside in the wind, struggling with a large metal generator. One of them waved when he saw the truck. "Jack!" "Thank God." The man who approached was Thomas Miller, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s. His thick gray beard was dusted with snow, and deep wrinkles lined his weathered face. Thomas had been the town's mechanic for more than 30 years, and had known Jack's parents well. Despite his rough appearance, Thomas had a patient, kind personality. People trusted him instinctively. He shook his head in frustration. "This generator won't start," he said. "The church is full of people trying to stay warm." Jack climbed out of the truck and knelt beside the machine. Years of military training had forced him to learn how to repair equipment under pressure. He opened the panel, checking the wiring carefully. Snow and moisture had seeped into the fuel line. "Give me 10 minutes, Jack said calmly. Rex sat nearby, watching the blowing snow as if guarding the small group. True to his word, the generator roared to life minutes later. Warm yellow light flooded the church windows. Thomas laughed in relief. "You really are your father's son," he said. Jack didn't respond, but something inside him shifted. For the next several hours, Jack moved across town like a quiet shadow in the storm. He pulled a stranded car out of a snowbank using the truck's tow chain. He helped an elderly couple reach the church shelter safely. The elderly man was Harold Benson, a thin man in his late 70s with pale skin and trembling hands. His wife, Margaret, was small and gentle, her silver hair tied in a neat bun beneath a wool hat. They clung to Jack's arm as he guided them through the deep snow. "Your mother helped us during the flood 20 years ago," Margaret said softly. Jack paused. "I remember," he replied quietly. But the storm wasn't finished yet. Late that night, as the wind began to howl even louder, Jack decided to head back toward the forest road leading home. The truck's headlights barely cut through the blizzard. Rex suddenly lifted his head. His ears stiffened. Then he barked sharply. Jack slowed the truck. "What is it?" Rex barked again and jumped toward the door. Jack frowned. Rex almost never barked without reason. He pulled the truck to the side of the snow-covered road. "All right," he said. "Show me." The moment the door opened, Rex leaped into the storm. Jack followed, pushing through the deep snow. The wind roared through the trees as Rex moved quickly between them, nose low to the ground. Then Jack saw it. A pair of faint tire tracks. They disappeared into the forest. Jack's stomach tightened. Someone had driven off the road. He hurried after Rex. A few minutes later, the beam of his flashlight revealed the wreck. A small blue sedan had slid down a slope and flipped onto its side against a cluster of trees. Snow was already beginning to bury the vehicle. Jack ran forward. "Hello?" he shouted. No answer. He forced open the partially crushed door. Inside, a woman was trapped against the seatbelt. She was unconscious. Her name, Jack would later learn, was Grace Harper. Grace was a woman in her early 30s, tall and slender, with long chestnut brown hair tangled around her pale face. Even in the dim light, Jack could see she had delicate features and calm, thoughtful eyes. The kind of person who probably spent more time listening than speaking. Though unconscious now, there was a quiet strength in her expression. Jack quickly cut the seatbelt with a small knife. "Easy," he murmured as he pulled her carefully from the car. Rex stood nearby, barking anxiously at the growing storm. Jack wrapped Grace in his coat and carried her through the snow back toward the truck. The wind was stronger now. The forest seemed almost alive with the storm. But finally, they reached the road. Jack placed Grace gently inside the truck and started the engine. Rex jumped into the passenger seat beside her, watching carefully, as if guarding the injured woman. Jack drove slowly back toward town. By the time they reached the small clinic, the storm had begun to weaken. Doctors rushed outside with a stretcher. As they carried Grace inside, one of the nurses looked at Jack with surprise. "You found her?" she asked. Jack nodded. He suddenly felt very tired. Outside, the snow had finally begun to fall more gently. For the first time in years, Jack noticed something strange. People in town were beginning to look at him differently. Not like a stranger, but like someone they could depend on. Just like his parents once were. And for the first time, Jack didn't feel the need to walk away from that. Spring arrived slowly after the long and brutal winter. At first, it was only small changes. The snow along the forest paths began to melt into narrow streams. Patches of dark soil appeared between the trees. The frozen lake outside town cracked and shifted as warmer sunlight touched the ice for the first time in months. For Jack, the change of season brought something else as well. Work. The old house he had inherited from his parents had survived the winter, but only barely. The roof leaked in 2 places. The porch boards had rotted from years of neglect, and the faded white paint on the walls peeled like old bark. But Jack didn't mind. Every morning he woke before sunrise. Rex followed him outside as he began repairing the house piece by piece. The German Shepherd had recovered almost completely from his old injury. The bandage that once wrapped his shoulder was gone now, revealing thick fur growing back over the scar. At 5 years old, Rex was in his prime, strong, alert, and fiercely loyal. While Jack worked, Rex often sat nearby on the grass, watching the forest like a silent guardian. The dog had a habit of tilting his head whenever Jack spoke, as if he understood every word. "All right, Supervisor," Jack joked one morning while fixing a loose porch beam. "Don't just sit there. Make sure I don't mess it up." Rex wagged his tail once. Weeks passed like this. Little by little, the house changed. The porch became sturdy again. New windows replaced the cracked glass. Jack even repaired the old wooden swing his mother once loved to sit on during warm evenings. One quiet afternoon, while Jack was repainting the front fence, he heard a car slowly approaching the gravel road. He turned. A dark green sedan stopped near the gate. The driver stepped out. It was Grace Harper. Since the night of the snowstorm, Grace had recovered well. The bruises from the accident had faded, and the tired expression she wore at the clinic had been replaced by something calmer. Grace was a woman in her early 30s, tall and slender with graceful posture. Her long, chestnut-brown hair usually fell over one shoulder, and her warm hazel eyes had a thoughtful, observant quality. Her skin carried a natural softness from spending more time indoors than outdoors. Grace had the quiet personality of someone who preferred listening before speaking. She worked as the town's librarian, a job that suited her calm nature. After losing her parents in a car accident years earlier, she had returned to the small town to rebuild her life. The accident during the snowstorm had nearly taken that life away again. But Jack had changed that. Grace walked toward the house, holding a small envelope. Rex stood up but didn't bark. He recognized her. "Well," Jack said, climbing down from the ladder. "Looks like you're fully recovered." Grace smiled gently. "Thanks to you." For a moment, the wind moved softly through the pine trees surrounding the house. Then Grace handed him the envelope. "I found something at the library archives," she said. Jack opened it carefully. Inside was an old photograph. The picture was faded with age, the edges slightly worn, but the people in it were unmistakable. His parents. The photo showed them standing beside a half-built wooden bridge over the town's river. Several townspeople were around them, holding tools and wooden planks. Jack stared quietly. His father looked younger, but still carried the same strong jawline and confident stance Jack remembered. His mother stood beside him, smiling warmly, her hand resting on a wooden beam as if she had helped build it herself. Grace spoke softly. "That bridge collapsed during a flood about 25 years ago," she explained. "Most people thought the town couldn't afford to rebuild it." Jack looked at the people in the photo again. "But your parents organized everyone," Grace continued. "They spent weeks working with volunteers. That bridge still stands today." Jack didn't say anything for a long time. He had always believed his parents lived simple, quiet lives. Now he realized something else. They had quietly changed the town around them. Grace watched him carefully. "They believed you'd come back someday," she said. Jack looked up. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated before answering. "Your mother used to say something when she visited the library," Grace said. "She told people that no matter how far you traveled, Someday you'd find your way home. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He turned toward the house. Inside, on a small wooden table in the living room, 2 letters rested carefully in a frame. The letters had been waiting for him for years. Later that afternoon, Jack hung the framed letters on the living room wall. He placed them beside the photograph Grace had brought. The room felt different now, like a place where the past and present had finally met. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Jack stepped outside onto the porch. The sky glowed orange and gold beyond the forest. Rex walked beside him and lay down near the steps. The dog stretched comfortably, resting his head on his paws. A few minutes later, the door opened behind Jack. Grace stepped outside, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to him. They sat side by side on the porch swing. Neither of them spoke for a while. The quiet evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Birds moved through the trees. A soft breeze carried the smell of pine and fresh earth. Jack looked across the valley toward the town. For years he believed returning here would only remind him of everything he had lost. But now he understood something different. He hadn't come back to relive the past. He had come back to continue it, to build something new from what his parents had started. Grace sipped her coffee quietly. "You know," she said with a small smile, "people in town talk about you a lot now." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That good or bad?" "Mostly good." Rex lifted his head at the sound of her voice, then relaxed again. The sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt something he hadn't expected to find here. Peace. After everything he had lost, after all the years he had spent running from the past, he finally understood why he had returned. Not to search for what was gone, but to begin the life waiting for him. And this time, he wasn't alone. Sometimes life takes away the things we love most, and it can feel like everything is lost. Jack believed he had lost his family, his purpose, and the place he once called home. But hidden behind an old wall were 2 letters and a tiny hope his parents had left behind. A hope that one day their son might return and find his way back. That small hope became real. And sometimes that is how miracles work. They are not always loud or dramatic. Often, they appear quietly, through the people we meet, the paths we walk, and the strength we find when we choose not to give up. Many believe that God works through moments like these, guiding us slowly, even when we cannot see the direction yet. What feels like an ending may actually be the beginning of something new. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in stories about faith, second chances, and quiet miracles, consider subscribing to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your life with hope and unexpected miracles.